Hey guys, for today's video we're going to take a look at one of the most inspirational figures in Scottish history, Sir William Wallace. I'm sure that most of you will be familiar with the blockbuster film Braveheart that was written and directed by Mel Gibson and then released in 1995. But the true story of William Wallace differs somewhat from the events portrayed in the movie. I go through some of those key differences at the end of the video, so stick around till the end and you can see what they are. For now though, we will begin with the true story of William Wallace. William Wallace was born in 1570 in Elderslie, Scotland, about 11 miles west of Glasgow. He was a member of nobility, albeit a lesser one. Now, not much is known about his family, and it is open to debate as to who his actual father was. It seems that academics are split down the middle, with one side believing the 15th century account of Blind Harry, who was an author, who gave the name Malcolm Wallace, and on the other side, William's own seal, found on a letter sent to the German city of Lübeck in 1297, which named his father as Alan Wallace. When Wallace was 16, the then King of Scotland, Alexander III, died in a riding accident, leaving his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as his only heir. Scottish lords set up a government of guardians until she would come of age and ascend to the throne herself. However, during the crossing to Scotland, on the 26th of September 1290, she fell ill and died. With no clear heir, Scotland plunged into turmoil and was on the brink of civil war as many prominent families laid their own claims to the throne. Enter King Edward I of England. He was invited to mediate between the arguing families, and by November 1292, Scotland recognised John Balliol as having the strongest claim, and was there soon after pronounced King of Scotland. However, it seems that King Edward was aware that Balliol was weak and ill-suited to sit on the throne, and by July 1296, King Edward seized his opportunity to rule England, and so forced Balliol to abdicate, after having sacked the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed and finally defeating the Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. Immediately after his triumph, he sent messengers to all the nobles in Scotland, demanding that they pay him homage and recognise him as their king. With Wallace now in his mid-20s, he had managed to pick up a considerable amount of military training, but when and where he did this remains unknown. Accounts of his physical stature differ. Blind Harry suggested that he was 7 feet tall, and Walter Bower, who was a chronicler, stated that Wallace had the body of a giant and was very well built. Either way, these accounts must be taken with a generous sprinkling of salt, as both men lived long after the death of Wallace and undoubtedly got their information through stories that have been passed down and probably somewhat embellished over each telling. It's unclear what prompted Wallace to rebel, but the first blow seems to have been struck in May 1297 when Wallace killed William de Heselrigg, the Sheriff of Lanark. He would later join the military leader Andrew Moray and continue to make small raids on English-held positions throughout Scotland. Of course, it was not long before an army was sent north to deal with what was now becoming a rebellion. The Battle of Stirling Bridge. By September 1297, the Scots controlled almost all of Scotland north of the Forth River, with the exception of Dundee. John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Surrey, along with Hugh de Cressingham, and their combined forces marched an army of some 3,000 cavalry and 10,000 infantry towards Stirling. It had been identified as a key entry point to the north of Scotland, and they needed to help Dundee stay under English control, while at the same time stamping out rebellion. The Scottish army also knew this, and had arrived first and camped out on Abbey Crag, which is where the Wallace Memorial stands today. There are no exact numbers, but it is believed that the Scottish army had about 6,000, less than half of what the English came with. However, the only thing separating the north and south sides of the river was a small wooden bridge that only allowed men to cross, perhaps only 3 abreast. The English knew that this put them at a tactical disadvantage and delayed attacking for several days while negotiations took place, but no resolution was ever reached. So on the morning of September the 11th, Warenne ordered that the English were to cross the bridge and begin their attack. While the infantry began to cross, a knight approached Warenne and offered to take 60 horses upstream so that they could cross in shallower waters in order to outflank the Scots. But Cressingham managed to convince the Earl to continue with an all-out assault across the bridge. The Scots were patient and waited for some 2,000 English to cross before making their move. Once over, they began the attack and cut in behind them to stop reinforcements from crossing. They made short work of the English that had crossed and then turned their attention and focused on the bridge, fighting 3 abreast in a similar way that the Spartans did at the Battle of Thermopylae. By the end of the fighting, more than half of the English that marched to fight that day lay dead or dying. With Surrey's confidence broken, he ordered the retreat and that the bridge be destroyed as they fell back to Berwick. Among the casualties on that day was Hugh de Cressingham, who is said to have been flayed and skinned, with small pieces handed out as tokens of victory. By November that year, Wallace had been knighted, after leading several more successful raids, this time in northern England. The Battle of Falkirk. King Edward Longshanks learned of the defeat at Stirling Bridge while he was in France agreeing terms for a truce with the French King Philip IV. He would return to England in March 1298, where he would continue making plans for a second invasion of Scotland, and this time with some 15,000 men, of which were 2,500 were cavalry and 13,500 were a mixture of Welsh and English infantry armed with a longbow. He also moved central government to the city of York. This was done as it was considered a strategic point in the north of England in which to mobilise an army quickly, giving the Scots less time to prepare. Edward then held a war council and sent for the Scottish nobles that had once paid him homage, none of whom showed. So in their absence, they were all declared traitors to the crown. With the decision to go to war now finalised, Edward commanding his army of 15,000 to assemble on the border town of Roxburgh, which lays about 25 miles southwest of Berwick-upon-Tweed. He then began to march them into Scotland. Wallace, however, was a clever man. Not only was he aware that the English were coming, he also knew that with a force of 6,000 men under his command, facing the English in open battle would surely end in defeat. So they followed the English army, intending to avoid battle until the English supplies ran out, leaving them with no other choice but to pull back to England. Things then went from bad to worse for King Edward. By the time Edward's army had reached the outskirts of Edinburgh, his troops were now low on morale and starving. A riot even broke out among the Welsh, and by the time it was brought under control, at least 80 men lay dead. It did not help either that Edward's supply fleet had been delayed due to bad weather. But just as he contemplated giving up, news arrived that Wallace was camped out some 13 miles away in the Callander Wood. This proved to be the opportunity that Edward was looking for. There was a quote I found in my research, and I'm not sure if Edward said this, but if so, it is fitting. It goes like this: "As God lives, they need not pursue me, for I will meet them this day." On Tuesday, the 22nd of July, the English finally caught up to the Scots, and this time the outcome would favour the English. In short, Edward's army was far better trained and had superior numbers. Catching the unsuspecting Scots by surprise, they had split up into 4 battalions and all but encircled them. Despite the Scots using their schultrons to great effect, Wallace's army did not stand a chance out in the open and were eventually picked off, mostly by the longbowmen, whose arrows managed to penetrate the spikes until the line was thin enough for the heavy cavalry to charge in and finish off the job. Recognising defeat, the remaining Scots, including Wallace, fled to the nearby forest of Torwood, where they would be safe. Then, in September 1298, Wallace resigned his commission as Guardian of Scotland. Little is known of his whereabouts or activities over the following 6 years, but it is believed that he travelled to France to plead with King Philip IV for help in the Scottish War of Independence. There is also evidence in the form of a letter sent to King Philip to his envoys in Rome in November 1300, demanding that they should help Wallace. Fast forward 4 years, and by 1304, Wallace was back in Scotland and seemed to be busy building up support for yet another rebellion. Then, on August the 5th, 1305, Wallace's luck finally ran out. He was betrayed by a Scottish knight called John de Menteith, who was loyal to King Edward. Wallace was arrested and sent to London to stand trial for treason. The trial took place at Westminster Hall on August the 23rd, where the charges were read out. They included treason and war crimes, including the indiscriminate killing of men, women, children, and those of religious learning, such as monks and nuns. In keeping with his character, Wallace replied to the charge of treason, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." After his trial, he was stripped naked and dragged through the city streets by horse, finally stopping at the Elms in Smithfield, whereupon he was hung, drawn, and quartered, eventually being beheaded and having it dipped in tar and placed atop London Bridge. His arms and legs were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed as a warning. Wallace never got to see his country free from English rule. The Scottish would have to wait nearly 9 years for that day, when in 1314 Robert the Bruce defeated King Edward II at the Battle of Bannockburn. Finally, in 1956, a plaque was unveiled near the site of his execution in Smithfield, which has text written in Latin and in Gaelic. The Latin inscription, when translated, reads like this: "I tell you the truth. Freedom is what is best, sons. Never live life like slaves." And the Gaelic inscription translates to simply death and victory. As I said at the beginning of the video, I was going to point out a few key differences between real-life events and those of the movie, so here are just a few. Firstly, Princess Isabel of France. You might remember that in the movie, Wallace had a love interest called Princess Isabel. Despite the character being based on a real-life princess of the same name, there is no record of her and Wallace ever having met, probably due to the fact that at the time of Wallace's death, she was only 10 years old. The next is Murren MacLanach, or Marion Braidfute. According to clanwallace.org, a study by Archer of contemporary historical records found no mention of any Braidfutes living in the area at the end of the 13th century. It was also reported that she is perhaps a metaphor for Scotland. Wallace is not known to have ever had any children or even a wife. And finally, William Wallace's sword. It is said that John de Menteith, the governor of Dumbarton Castle, received Wallace's sword shortly after his execution. It eventually found its way into the hands of King James IV of Scotland in 1505, where records suggest that he paid an armourer 26 shillings to have it bound in cords of silk with a new hilt, plummet, scabbard and belt. Legend says that Wallace's original scabbard was made from the skin of Sir Hugh de Cressingham, the treasurer of English administration in Scotland, who was killed at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. I hope you all enjoyed this week's video. Let me know what you thought of it in the comment section down below, and if you have any suggestions for content that you wish to see, then please let me know. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you all in the next one. Bye for now.